The Greek Poropulos, Edgar Wallace, at Carolina, in the Transvaal, was a store kept by a man named Laski, who was a Polish Jew. There was an officers' clubhouse, the steward of which was a Greek sportsman named Poropulos, and this story is about these two men, and about an officer of Hampton Scouts who took too much wine and saw a pair of boots. I have an intense admiration for George Poropulos, and I revere his memory. I admire him for his nerve, though, for the matter of that, his nerve was no greater than mine. Long before the war came, when the negotiations between Great Britain and the Transvaal government were in the diplomatic stage, I drifted to Carolina from the Rand, leaving behind me in the Golden City much of ambition, hope, and all the money I had brought with me from England. I came to South Africa with a young wife and pound 370 within a few shillings because the doctors told me the only chance I had was in such a hot, dry climate as the highlands of Africa afforded. For my own part, there was a greater attraction in the possibility of turning those few hundreds of mine into thousands, for Johannesburg was in the delirium of a boom. I left Johannesburg nearly penniless. I could not, at the moment, explain the reason of my failure, for the boom continued, and I had the advantage of the expert advice of Arthur Laski, who was staying at the same boarding house as myself. There were malicious people who warned me against Laski. His own compatriots, sharp men of business, told me to wear Laski, but I ignored the advice because I was very confident in my own judgment, and Laski was a plausible, handsome man, a little flashy in appearance, but decidedly a beautiful animal. He was in Johannesburg on a holiday, he said. He had stores in various parts of the country where he sold everything from broomsticks to farm wagons, and he bore the evidence of his prosperity. He took us to the theatre, or rather he took Lillian, for I was too seedy to go out much. I did not grudge Lillian the pleasure. Life was very dull for a young girl whose middle-aged husband had a spot on his lung, and Laski was so kind and gentlemanly, so far as Lil was concerned, that the only feeling I had in the matter was one of gratitude. He was tall and dark, broad-shouldered, with a set to his figure and swing of carriage that excited my admiration. He was possessed of enormous physical strength, and I have seen him take two quarreling Kaffirs men of no ordinary muscularity and knock their heads together. He had an easy, ready laugh, a fund of stories, some a little coarse, I thought, and a florid gallantry which must have been attractive to women. Lil always brightened up wonderfully after an evening with him. His knowledge of mines and mining propositions was bewildering. I left all my investments in his hands, and it proved something of my trust in him, that when, day by day, he came to me for money, to carry over stock whatever that means I paid without hesitation. Not only did I lose every penny I possessed, but I found myself in debt to him to the extent of £100. Poor Lil. I broke the news to her of my ruin, and she took it badly, reproached, stormed, and wept in turn, but quieted down when I told her that in the kindness of his heart, Laski had offered me a berth at his Carolina store. I was to get £16 a month, half of which was to be paid in stores at wholesale prices and the other half in cash. I was to live rent-free in a little house near the store. I was delighted with the offer. It was an immediate rise, though I foresaw that the conditions of life would be much harder than the life to which I had been accustomed in England. We travelled down the Delagoa line to Middelburg, and found a Cape cart waiting to carry us across the 20 miles of rolling veldt. The first 6 months in Carolina were the happiest I have ever spent. The work in the store was not particularly arduous. I found that it had the reputation of being one of the best equipped stores in the Eastern Transvaal, and certainly we did a huge business for so small a place. It was not on the town we depended, but upon the surrounding country. Laski did not come back with us, but after we had been installed for a week he came and took his residence in the store. All went well for 6 months. He taught Lil to ride and drive, and every morning they went cantering over the veldt together. Me he treated more like a brother than an employee, and I found myself hotly resenting the uncharitable things that were said about him, for Carolina, like other small African towns, was a hotbed of gossip. Lil was happy for that 6 months, then I began to detect a change in her attitude toward me. She was snappy, easily offended, insisted upon having her own room, to which I agreed, for, although my chest was better, I still had an annoying cough at night which might have been a trial to anybody within hearing. It was about this time that I met Poropulos. He came into the store on a hot day in January, a little man of 45 or thereabouts. He was unusually pale, and had a straggling, weedy beard. His hair was long, his clothes were old and stained, and so much of his shirt as was revealed at his throat was sadly in need of laundering, yet he was cheerful and _debonair and singularly flippant. He stalked in the store, looked around critically, nodded to me, and smiled. Then he brought his jam book down on the counter with a smack. "Where's Shylock?" he asked easily. I am afraid that I was irritated. "Do you mean Mr. Layersky?" "Shylock," I said, he repeated. "Shylock Stein. The Lothario of Carolina." He smacked the counter again, still smiling. I was saved the trouble of replying. For at that moment Layersky entered. He stopped dead and frowned when he saw the Greek. "What do you want, you little beast?" he asked harshly. For answer, the man leaned up against the counter, ran his fingers through his straggling beard, and cocked his head. "I want justice," he said unctuously, "the restoration of money stolen. I want to send a wreath to your funeral. I want to write your biography." "Clear out," shouted Layersky. His face was purple with anger, and he brought his huge fist down upon the counter with a crash that shook the wooden building. He might have been uttering the most pleasant of compliments, for all the notice the Greek took. Crash went Layersky's fist on the counter. Smash came Poropulos's jam book. There was something mocking and derisive in his action that made Layersky mad. With one spring he was over the counter, astride, and he had his hand on the Greek's collar, and then he stepped back quickly with every drop of blood gone from his face, for the Greek's knife had flashed under his eyes. I thought Layersky was stabbed, but it was fear that made him white. The Greek rested the point of the knife on the counter and twiddled it round absent-mindedly, laying his palm on the hilt and spinning it with great rapidity. "Nearly did it that time, my friend," he said, with a note of regret. "Nearly did it that time. I shall be hanged for you yet." Layersky was white and shaking. "Come in here," he said in a low voice, and the little Greek followed him to the back parlor. They were together for about an hour. Sometimes I could hear Mr. Layersky's voice raised angrily, sometimes Poropulos's little laugh. When they came out again, the Greek was smiling still and smoking one of my employer's cigars. "My last word to you," said Layersky huskily, "is this: keep your mouth closed and keep away from me." "And my last word to you," said Poropulos, jauntily puffing at the cigar, "is this: turn honest, and enjoy a sensation." He stepped forth from the store with the air of one who had gained a moral victory. I never discovered what hold the Greek had over my master. I gathered that at some time or another, Poropulos had lost money, and that he held Layersky responsible. In some mysterious way Poropulos and I became friends. He was an adventurer of a type. He bought and sold in different mining propositions, took up contracts, and, I believe, was not above engaging in the illicit gold-buying business. His attitude to Lillian was one of complete adoration. When he was with her his eyes never left her face. It was about this time that my great sorrow came to me. Layersky went away to Durban to buy stock, he said, and a few days afterwards Lillian, who had become more and more exigent, demanded to be allowed to go to Cape Town for a change. I shall remember that scene. I was at breakfast in the store when she came in. She was white, I thought, but her pallor suited her. With her beautiful black hair and great dark eyes, she came to the point without any preliminary. "I want to go away," she said. I looked up in surprise. "Go away, dear? Where?" She was nervous. I could see that from the restless movement of her hands. "I want to go to Cape Town. I know a girl there. I'm sick of this place. I hate it." She stamped her foot, and I thought that she was going to break into a fit of weeping. Her lips trembled, and for a time she could not control her voice. "I am going to be ill if you don't let me go," she said at last. "I can feel." "But the money, dear," I said, for it was distressing to me that I could not help her toward the holiday she wanted. "I can find the money," she said, in an unsteady voice. "I have got a few pounds saved. The allowance you gave me for my clothes, I didn't spend it all. Let me go, Charles, please, please." I drove her to the station, and took her ticket for Pretoria. I would have taken her to the capital, but I had the store to attend to. "By the way, what will your address be?" I asked just as the train was moving off. She was leaning over the gate of the car platform, looking at me strangely. "I will wire it. I have it in my bag," she called out, and I watched the tail of the train round the curve, with an aching heart. There was something wrong. What it was I could not understand. Perhaps I was a fool. I think I was. I think I have said that I had made friends with Poropulos. Perhaps it would be more truthful to say that he made friends with me, for he had to break down my feeling of distrust and disapproval. Then, again, I was not certain how Mr. Layersky would regard such a friendship, but, to my surprise, he took very little notice of it, or, for the matter of that, of me. Poropulos came into the store the night my wife left. Business was slack, there was war in the air, rumors of ultimatums had been persistent, and the Dutch farmers had avoided the store. A week passed, and I began to worry, for I had not heard from Lil. I had had a letter from Layersky, telling me that in view of the unsettled condition of the country he was extending his stay in Durban for a fortnight. The letter gave me the fullest instructions as to what I was to do in case war broke out, but, unfortunately, I had no opportunity of putting them into practice. The very day I received the letter, a Boer commando rode into Carolina, and at the head of it rode the Landdrost Peter de Huys, a pleasant man, whom I knew slightly. He came straight to the store, dismounted, and entered. "Good morning, Mr. Gray," he said. "I fear that I come on unpleasant business." "What is that?" I asked. "I have come to commandeer your stock in the name of the Republic," he said, "and to give you the tip to clear out. It does not sound possible, but it is nevertheless a fact that in 2 hours I had left Carolina, leaving Lasky's store in the hands of the Boers, and bringing with me receipts signed by the Landdrost for the goods he had commandeered. In 4 hours I was in a cattle truck with a dozen other refugees on my way to Pretoria, for I had elected to go to Durban to inform Lasky at first hand of what had happened. Of the journey down to the coast it is not necessary to speak. We were 60 hours en route. We were without food, and had little to drink. At Ladysmith I managed to get a loaf of bread and some milk. At Maritzburg I got my first decent meal. But I arrived in Durban, tired, dispirited, and hungry. Lasky was staying at the Royal, and as soon as I got to the station I hailed a rickshaw to take me there. There had been no chance of telegraphing. The wires were blocked with government messages. We had passed laden troop trains moving up to the frontier, and had cheered the quiet men in khaki who were going, all of them, to years of hardship and privation, any of them to death. The vestibule of the Royal was crowded, but I made my way to the office. "Lasky?" said the clerk. "Mr. and Mrs. Lasky, number 84. You'll find your way to their sitting room." I went slowly up the stairs, realizing in a flash the calamity. I did not blame Lil, it was a hard life I had brought her to. I had been selfish, as sick men are selfish, inconsiderate. They stood speechless, as I opened the door and entered. I closed the door behind me. Still they stood, Lil as pale as death, with terror and shame in her eyes, Lasky in a black rage. Well? It was he who broke the silence. He was defiant, shameless, and as I went on to talk about what had happened at the store, making no reference to what I had seen, his lips curled contemptuously. But Lil, womanlike, rushed in with explanations. She had meant to go to Cape Town. The train service had been bad. She had decided to go to Durban. Mr. Lasky had been kind enough to book her a room. I let her go on. When she had finished I handed my receipts to Lasky. "That ends our acquaintance, I think." "As you like," he replied with a shrug. I turned to Lillian. "Come, my dear," I said, but she made no move, and I saw Lasky smile again. I lost all control over myself and leapt at him, but his big fist caught me before I could reach him, and I went down, half stunned. I was no match for him. I knew that, and if the blow did nothing else, it sobered me. I picked myself up. I was sick with misery and hate. "Come, Lil," I said again. She was looking at me, and I thought I saw a look of disgust in her face. I did not realize that I was bleeding, and that I must have been a most unpleasant figure. I only knew that she loathed me at that moment, and I turned on my heel and left them, my own wife and the big man who had broken me. One forgets things in wartime. I joined the Imperial Light Horse and went to the front. The doctor passed me as sound, so I suppose that all that is claimed for the climate of Africa is true. We went into Ladysmith, and I survived the siege. I was promoted for bringing an officer out of action under fire. I earned a reputation for daring, which I did not deserve, because always I was courting swift death, and taking risks to that end. Before Buller's force had pushed away through the stubborn lines to our relief, I had received my commission. More wonderful to me, I found myself a perfectly healthy man, as hard as nails, as callous as the most experienced soldier. Only, somewhere down in my heart, a little worm gnawed all the time, sleeping or waking, fighting or resting. I thought of Lillian, and wondered. Ladysmith was relieved. We marched on toward Pretoria. I was transferred to Hampton's horse with the rank of major, and for 18 months I moved up and down the eastern Transvaal chasing a will-o'-the-wisp of a commandant, who was embarrassing the blockhouse lines. Then one day I came upon Poropulos. We were encamped outside Standerton when he rode in on a sorry-looking burnt-out pony. He had been in the country during the war, he said, buying and selling horses. He did not mention Lasky's name to me, and so studiously did he avoid referring to the man, that I saw at once that he knew. It was brought home to me by his manner that he had a liking for me that I had never guessed. In what way I had earned his regard I cannot say, but it was evident he entertained a real affection for me. We parted after an hour's chat. He was going back to Carolina. He had a scheme for opening an officers' club in that town, where there was always a large garrison, and to which the wandering columns came from time to time to be re-equipped. As for me, I continued the weary chase of the flying commando. Trek, in fierce heat, in torrential downpour, over smooth veldt and broken hills, skirmishing, sniping, and now and then a sharp engagement, with a dozen casualties on either side. 4 months passed, and the column was ordered into Carolina for a refit. I went without qualms, though I knew she was there, and Lasky was there. We got into Carolina in a thunderstorm, and the men were glad to reach a place that bore some semblance of civilization. My brother officers, after our long and profitless trek, were overjoyed at the prospect of a decent dinner, for Poropulos's club was already famous among the columns. My horse picked up a stone and went dead lame, so I stayed behind to talk to him, and rode to Carolina 2 hours after the rest of the column had arrived. It was raining heavily as I came over a fold of the hill that showed the straggling township. There was no human being in sight save a woman who stood by the roadside, waiting, and I knew instinctively, long before I reached her, that it was Lillian. I cantered toward her. Her face was turned in my direction, and she stood motionless as I drew rein and swung myself to the ground. She was changed, not as I expected, for sorrow and suffering had etherealized her. Her big eyes burned in a face that was paler than ever. Her lips, once so red and full, were almost white. "I have been waiting for you," she said. "Have you, dear? You are wet." She shook her head impatiently. I slipped off my mackintosh and put it about her. "He has turned me out," she said. She did not cry. I think she had not recovered from the shock. Something stirred from the thin cloak she was wearing. A feeble cry was muffled by the wrapping. "I have got a little girl," she said, "but she is dying." She began to cry silently, the tears running down her wet face in streams. I took her into Carolina, found a Dutch woman who put her and the baby to bed, and gave her some coffee. I went up to the officers' club just after sunset and met Poropulos coming down. He was in a terrible rage, and was muttering to himself in some tongue I could not understand. "Oh, here you are." He almost spat the words in his anger. "That dog Lasky." He was about to say something, but checked himself. I think it was about Lillian that he intended to speak at first, but he changed the subject to another grievance. I was brought before the magistrate and fined £100 for selling field force tobacco. "My club will be ruined," Lasky informed the police by. He was incoherent in his passion. I gathered that he had been engaged in some shady business, and that Lasky had detected him. He almost danced before me in the rain. "Shylock dies tonight," he said, and waved his enemy out of the world with one sweep of his hand. "He dies tonight. I am weary of him. For 19 years I have known him, and he's dirt right through." He went out without another word. I stood on the slope of the hill watching him. I dined at the club, and went straight back to the house where I had left my wife. She was sleeping, but the baby was dead. Poor little mortal. I owed it no grudge, but I was glad when they told me. All the next day I sat by her bed listening to Lillian's mutterings, for she was very ill. I suffered all the tortures of a damned soul sitting there, for she spoke of Lasky Arthur. She called him, prayed to him for mercy, told him she loved him. I was late for dinner at the club. There was a noisy crowd there. Young Harvey of my own regiment had had too much to drink, and I avoided his table. My hand shook as I poured out a glass of wine, and somebody remarked on it. I did not see Poropulos until the dinner was halfway through. Curiously enough, I looked at the clock as he came in, and the hands pointed to 8:30. The Greek was steward of the club, and was serving the wine. He was calm, impassive, remarkably serene, I thought. He exchanged jokes with the officers who were grumbling that they had had to wait for the fulfillment of their orders. "It was 10 to 8 when I ordered this," grumbled one man. Then, suddenly, Harvey, who had been regarding Poropulos with drunken gravity, pointed downward. "He's changed his boots," he said, and chuckled. Poropulos smiled amiably and went on serving. "He's changed his boots," repeated Harvey, concentrating his mind upon trivialities as only a drunken man can. The men laughed. "Oh, dry up, Harvey," said somebody. "He's changed." He got no further. Through the door came a military policeman, splashed from head to foot with mud. "District Commandant here, sir?" he demanded. "There's been a man murdered, soldier?" asked a dozen voices. "No, sir, storekeeper. Name of Lasky shot dead half an hour ago. I do not propose to tell in detail all that happened following that. Too smart, C.I.D. Men came down from Johannesburg, made a few inquiries, and arrested Poropulos. He was expecting the arrest, and half an hour before the officers came he asked me to go to him. I spent a quarter of an hour with him, and what we said is no man's business but ours. He told me something that startled me. He loved Lillian, too. I had never guessed it, but I did not doubt him. But it was finally for Lillian's sake that he made me swear an oath so dreadful that I cannot bring myself to write it down, an oath so unwholesome, and so against the grain of a man, that life after it could only be a matter of sickness and shame. Then the police came and took him away. Layersky had been shot dead in the store by some person who had walked in when the store was empty, at a time when there was nobody in the street. This person had shot the Jew dead and walked out again. The police theory was that Poropulos had gone straight from the club, in the very middle of dinner, had committed the murder, and returned to continue his serving, and the crowning evidence was the discovery that he had changed his boots between 7.30 and 8.30. The mud-stained boots were found in a cellar, and the chain of evidence was completed by the statement of a trooper who had seen the Greek walking from the direction of the store, at 8.10, with a revolver in his hand. Poropulos was cheerful to the last, cheerful through the trial, through the days of waiting in the fort at Johannesburg. I confess nothing, he said to the Greek priest. I hated Layersky, and I am glad that he is dead, that is all. It is true that I went down to kill him, but it was too late. When they pinioned him he turned to me. I have left my money to you, he said. There is about £4,000. You will look after her, that is the only reason I am alive. Did you murder Arthur Layersky? Said the priest again. No, said Poropulos, and smiled as he went to his death. And what he said was true, as I know. I shot Layersky,